Good morning, everybody. If we haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is D. Smith. I'm the high school pastor here at Eastwind. I'm excited to have a chance to teach this morning, and I really feel like the message that I have for us this morning is more of a teaching than some of the ones that I've done in the past. We're going to be diving into a couple of different spots in Scripture. I'm going to bring a couple of Hebrew words to you. Hopefully there's something in this for us because God has this gift of Sabbath, and I want us to really understand what that gift is. We're in the third week of a conversation about Sabbath, which is really part of a larger conversation that we started last fall about practicing the way of Jesus and taking the practices that Jesus adopted that were practices of his faith, and through those practices being with Jesus, and by being with Jesus to become more like him, and as we become more like Jesus, doing the things that Jesus would do if he were us. And as a Jewish man who followed the law of Moses, Sabbath was a practice of Jesus. Now, how do I know this? Well, there are a couple of places in the Gospels, the four biographies of Jesus, that talk about Jesus going to the synagogue on a Sabbath day or teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath. But I also get this out of our understanding that Jesus was without sin. Jesus was perfect, and the Sabbath was given to the Israelites as part of the Ten Commandments. I think we lose track of that sometimes, but in the Ten Commandments, right between you should have no other gods before me and have no idols, and do not murder and do not commit adultery, is to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And Jesus added to our understanding of what the Sabbath is. Jesus was once confronted for not observing the Sabbath in the way that was expected. And Jesus' rebuke, or his response to his accusers, was to tell them that man was not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. It's a gift that's one of the Ten Commandments. And I'm going to argue that the Sabbath is a gift given to us to give us what we really want, to give us the desires of our heart, the same things that people have been trying to get since the beginning of humanity. We've always been looking for whatever gives us joy, whatever gives us peace, or whatever gives us meaning or significance or purpose in life. And the Bible contains, among its 66 books, it contains a really interesting and slightly depressing study of this pursuit of meaning. And it's found in the book of Ecclesiastes. In the book of Ecclesiastes, and remember, the Bible contains 66 different books written by dozens of different authors over the course of more than 1,000 years in two different ancient languages. And among those are a handful of different genres of books. You have some that are histories, and some that are prophecies, and some that are poetry. And Ecclesiastes is part of what's considered the wisdom books of the Bible, which also includes the book of Proverbs. And those books were written to give special wisdom to those who are reading. And the book of Ecclesiastes doesn't just immediately identify its author. There are a lot of clues in it that point to King Solomon, the son of David, as having been the author of Ecclesiastes. But whoever the author is, this book is their exploration of finding meaning. And in his pursuit, the author denies himself nothing. He pursues everything to the extreme, and he turns over every rock, whether that is pleasure or wealth or accomplishment through work or wisdom or knowledge. And in every extreme that he pursues, he does not find that satisfying meaning. Over and over again, he says that this as well is vanity or meaningless. And the word that we translate there as vanity or meaningless is the word hebel, which its most direct translation is as breath or vapor. And what he's saying is, yeah, those things, that pleasure or that wealth or that accomplishment, like it's good for a second, but then you need more, just like you need another breath. Like it won't sustain and it won't last. And eventually you can't get any more, and it's ultimately meaningless. Like I said, Ecclesiastes, slightly depressing, but it's okay. Because a few spots in the book, the author points to a handful of things that are worthwhile. There's a counter theme that carries throughout the book, and it's written a little bit differently each place that it pops up. But in the 8th chapter of Ecclesiastes, the author says it this way. He says, "So I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of the life God has given them under the sun." He says, eat, drink, and be glad. Eat, drink, and be merry. This is a worthwhile thing to have in your life. But then he closes the book with a slightly different direction. In the closing of the book, he says, here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. This is like the summary of the scripture's understanding of wisdom, of finding meaning in life. And now here's my question for you, and this is something we do every Sunday morning. We hit pause in the message to give you a chance to turn and chat with the people around you. So on one hand, he says, eat, drink, and be glad. And on the other hand, he says, fear God and keep his commandments. Do you see these as having harmony, or is there a tension between them, or maybe a little bit of both? I'm going to give you a minute. We're going to play a little music. If you're joining us online, hey, drop your thoughts about this in the chat. If you're in this space, maybe turn to somebody around you and share with them. These two ideas, are they in harmony, are they in tension, or a little bit of both? I'll give you a minute. I'll come back up. Thanks. So I think this question, I think it's actually kind of significant, right? Like, what is the meaning found in? Is it eat, drink, and be glad? Is it fear God and keep his commandments? What is following Jesus all about? Is it about reverence and fear and work and like abstinence in life? Or is following Jesus all about feasting and partying and laughing and friendship and fellowship and fun? And as I follow Jesus, I think I find more and more that the answer is just yes. Like the answer is yes to all of those. I see harmony between these because I think following Jesus is all of the human experience submitted to him and in pursuit of him, which means that following Jesus is both reverence and laughter. Following Jesus is both effort and delight. It is both difficulty and fellowship. And I think how we see this matters, because if you believe that following Jesus is only fun and laughter and friendship, and your declaration of faith is Jesus is my homeboy, and that's where it ends, I think that you will be ill-equipped for the difficulties that Jesus promises are going to be a part of the life of following him. But on the other hand, that if you believe that following Jesus is only seriousness and labor, and you're a soldier in the trenches, keep your head down and push forward, no funny business, I think that your faith is going to be missing one of the things that God offers us as a life of following him. Because I believe that our faith in Jesus and our life with God was always intended to be a delight. We were always intended to find delight in God, to find fullness of joy in our relationship with him. In the book of Psalms, we see God intersect with the full range of human emotions. And in the 16th Psalm, the psalmist is speaking to the Lord, and he says, "You will show me the way of life, and being with you is to be full of joy. In your right hand there is happiness forever." He paints a picture that life with God includes this joy. And then in the 37th Psalm, we see delighting in the Lord talked about this way: take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And when I first heard this verse as a high school student, my ears popped up, and I was like, oh, is this the secret to getting the stuff I want? Like, finally, I just take a little delight in God, and my 40 time is going to drop by about 4 seconds, and I'm going to get a football scholarship, and I'm going to get a sweet car. It's going to be awesome. But you don't have to study this very deeply to be like, that's not what it's about. This is really another way to say the bottom line of Ecclesiastes. The author of Ecclesiastes did everything he could in the pursuit of the desires of his heart. And he got everything he wanted, but he didn't get what he really wanted. He didn't really want sex or substances or money or accomplishments or wisdom. What he really wanted was joy and peace and purpose. And the psalmist is saying, delight yourself in God, and he will give you the things you really want. Not the vanities or the vapors, but substance and meaning and true joy. But what does this have to do with Sabbath? I told you, we're in the third week of a conversation about Sabbath. Well, in the book of Isaiah, we get a really cool glimpse into what Sabbath could be and should be. In Isaiah chapter 58, Isaiah writes this. He says, "If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight, and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. See, the Sabbath, we talked about the last couple of weeks stopping and resting, but it's not just a day to stop from your work and not just a day to rest, but it is also a day to delight in God. When Carlos started this conversation about Sabbath a couple of weeks ago, we talked about 4 movements of the Sabbath, starting with stopping, and after stopping, resting, but then also delight and worship. In the last couple of weeks, Carlos outlined how we follow the example of God himself in stopping and resting, and we follow the example of the ancient Israelites and the rebellion against the Egypts of our life, that we trust God to provide while we rest. And Carlos gave us this challenge to find a time, to set aside a specific time for Sabbath, and to choose a ritual that would set that time apart from the rest of the time in our life, and to set boundaries to keep that space and time holy. But here's the thing. Now, let's say you did that this week. You found a time, you chose a ritual, you set some boundaries, and then you were like, all right, now what? Now what do I do? Like, all right, I got this whole day. What am I supposed to do with this time? Am I supposed to sit here on my couch and stare at the wall? Am I supposed to pray for like 24 hours? Am I supposed to fast? Like, what is this supposed to look like? And I think this is an important question because in our 21st century American life, we have so many options for what to do with our time, and sorting out what should be a part of a Sabbath space, I think, is really important. And I'm going to try to give you part of an answer today because we're talking about 4 movements of Sabbath: stop, rest, delight, and worship. I really think the first 2 movements, stop and rest, they create space for the second 2, for delight and for worship. And Carlos next week is going to take us into a conversation about worship. I think that's really important. I don't want you to miss that. But today we're going to be looking at delight. Today we're going to look at delight. And this conversation about Sabbath, it all starts with Genesis chapter 2. This is where you see the story of creation. And God for 6 days has created. And then on the 7th day, at the completion of that creation work, he stops and he rests. And the word that we translate as rest there is Shabbat. And Shabbat also is a word that's translated as Sabbath. They are one and the same. And it means to stop, but it also carries this tone, this connotation of delighting in the work that's been done. Think about it this way. Obviously, everything's covered in snow right now. Let's fast forward a couple of months. Things are starting to green up. Maybe you've got a nice big yard and you spend all day out in the yard. You're like trimming stuff down. You're trimming bushes. You're pulling weeds. You're fixing your fence, spiffing it up. Like you're cleaning things up. And then at the end of that day, you go inside, you rinse off, you get a nice meal and a nice cold lemonade. And you sit out on your back patio or your porch and you savor, you enjoy the work that you have done. That's the tone here. Or maybe you work and you've been working with a team for a couple of months on a big project and it's been a little stressful and you finally get that project shipped off and your customer loves it. Your team crushed it and you get together as a group and you celebrate. That is the tone here. Or perhaps you're a parent like I am and you've been investing in trying to help your kid reach a certain milestone. In our house, we've been potty training the last few weeks. And it has been a journey. But guys, we are 5 days without an accident right now. And we are delighting in the outcome of that work, right? That is the tone that's carried in this word. And in Genesis 2, so we see that God stops and rests. And we also see that he blessed the Sabbath day. And that Hebrew word that's translated as blessed is barak, which means blessed. And it carries this tone of made happy. In that point, God says the Sabbath is a happy day. It's a 24-hour period to follow God's example, to stop and to rest, yes, but also to delight. Also to delight. We are invited to delight in God's world. In that world that he spent 6 days creating, to look and to see what is good and what is beautiful and what is true. When God stopped and he looked at what had been created, he called it good. He saw the goodness in it, and we are invited to do the same, to see with fresh eyes the good things in the world around us. We're also invited to delight in your life in God. It is so easy to see the negative things in life and to lose sight of the things that are good. Our biological wiring, our brains are drawn towards the negative. Let's say you have, like last week, you had a day where you had 12 conversations with people, right? And 11 of those were people just like hyping you up. They were like, you look great, you smell good, your hair is awesome, you're crushing your job, your kids are amazing, like you're making straight, whatever. Like they're just straight gassing you up. And then one person is like, you know what? I don't like you. At the end of that day, what is your mind going to be thinking about? It's not going to be thinking about all the great things that somebody said. Your mind is naturally drawn toward the negative. And so on the Sabbath day, we are invited to delight in the good things in our life, with fresh eyes to look for what is good and beautiful. And then finally, we are invited to delight in God himself, in the access that we have through Jesus' life, his death, ultimately his resurrection and the Holy Spirit, into relationship with God. And many of us, even those of us who have decided to follow Jesus, if we are honest, we have yet to really learn how to just enjoy God. To believe in him, yes, absolutely. To learn from him, sure, you bet. To obey him, let's be honest. But enjoy him, man, we're still trying to figure that out. And the longer I follow Jesus, the more I just pursue wanting and desiring that delight in God and finding ways to connect with him that bring that kind of joy. And I've started to see that when you get there, the reward for a relationship with Jesus just is Jesus. It is a relationship to delight in. And Sabbath is a day to enjoy that delight. Psychologist Drew Allender talked about Sabbath this way. He said, the Sabbath is an invitation to enter delight. The Sabbath, when experienced as God intended, is the best day of our lives. Without question or thought, the best day of the week. And now I'm sure he's talking about a Saturday Sabbath here when he says it's a day that he anticipates on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, and then a day that is remembered fondly on Sunday and Monday and Tuesday. He said Sabbath is the holy time where we feast, play, dance, have sex, sing, pray, laugh, tell stories, read, paint, walk, and watch creation in all of its fullness. Few people are willing to enter the Sabbath and sanctify it to make it holy, because a full day of delight and joy is more than most people can bear in a lifetime, let alone a week. I hope you're starting to get the picture that Sabbath is not a day of dreary religious obligation or a sacrifice of boredom and dread. It is a life-giving day of beauty and joy and hope and the highlight of a well-lived week. But you might be saying, and I hear you, you might be saying, well, D, I already have a day for delight. Actually, I've got two of them, and we call it the weekend. We're living for the weekend, right? Saturday and Sunday, those are my days for R&R, when I go hike or ski or sit by the pool or float the river or get together with friends or fire up the Xbox or the grill or go to a brewery or whatever. Like, I've already got that space. I have my weekend. My question is, like, honestly, how is that working for you? Like, do you end your weekend feeling rested and restored and rejuvenated and ready to dive into a fresh week? Do you end your weekend feeling closer to and connected with God? Do you end your weekend full of delight and joy and gratitude? Or no? I really feel that the weekend has co-opted something that was holy and amazing. I feel like the weekend is really a counterfeit Sabbath. It is a time where we pursue leisure without devotion. A time block where, like, ostensibly you bring in some things that could be part of a healthy Sabbath, but free from devotion to God or obedience to him, and often free from the life-giving gift of rest and trust. We don't need more weekend. We don't need 3-day weekends or 4-day weekends. We need Sabbath. Carlos last week talked about how Sabbath is an act of resistance against the gods of achievement and accomplishment. And he also talked a little bit about how Sabbath is an act of trust. It is trusting that God is actually the provider, not me. It is trusting that he can do more with 6 days than I can do with 7. It is trusting that I don't have to be striving all the time to get those things that I think that I want, that I can put the outcomes in his hands. And when we think about this, like, the most obvious application of that trust is trusting that God will meet your physical needs or your financial needs, trusting that your bills will still be paid if you don't put in that extra overtime, trusting that there will be food on the table and clothes for your children. Like, that's the most obvious application of that trust. But I also think that it means trusting that God will meet your needs for joy and your needs for delight and your needs for relationships, that you can take that day and lean into him and the life that he's given. And if you, like God, honored and pursuing activities and not feel like you're missing something, not feel like you wasted a day off. And I've tested this, and honestly, like, here's what I found. When I choose to take one of the days out of my weekend and I set it apart as Sabbath, and I make a plan for it to be intentional and delighting in God and refraining from work or labor, I find more joy in that day than I ever have in a packed weekend full of really good things that still left me exhausted at the end. So how do we practice Sabbath delight? I think the first thing that we have to do is we have to slow down. Like, we have to slow down. I spent the first 35 years of my life trying to maximize my days and my time, like the perfect amount of sleep and have the perfect morning routine and like find the perfect amount of like ratio of work and accomplishment with leisure and connection with others. And then I've spent the last 5 years of my life just trying to slow that pace down, because I think that delight has a speed. Like, delight has a speed, and it is not rushed. Delight exists at the speed of savoring. Delight exists at the speed of savoring. It is the pace of a stroll, and it does not fit well into a fully packed schedule or calendar with no margins. So we have to find a way to slow down. And then the second thing we have to do is we have to set some boundaries. If your life is generally full, and maybe full in a good way, maybe full of relationships or family or work or leisure or whatever, like if your life is generally full and then you try to take some time in that life and you try to like set that time aside and you're like, okay, we're going to clear some stuff out, but you don't put boundaries around it, everything else is just going to pile in. Like, what do we learn in high school physics, right? Like, nature abhors a vacuum. If there's a high pressure area out here and a low pressure area right here, everything is going to flow into it unless boundaries are put up to keep those things out. I think a great place to start if you're considering like, okay, what do I do on a Sabbath day, is just to start with 2 lists, and not like 2 lists that are like this is the law, but 2 lists that are helpful boundaries to say, okay, here are the things that I will do, and here are the things that I won't do. And this is really up to you to figure out, but it might look like, well, I will sleep, and I will pray, and I will gather with community, and I will maybe find some time to be alone, and I will celebrate the good things in my life. And on the other hand, you might be like, I will not set an alarm. I will not go shopping. I will not read the news. I will not scroll on my phone. Like, you'll figure out what are the things that I have to put boundaries up to keep out of this space. And as Haley and I are working to develop like a Sabbath practice that works well in our stage of life, we're talking these conversations right now. Like, what are the things that collectively as a couple we're saying, like, we're going to definitely make sure when we Sabbath, like, this is a part of it. And we're going to definitely make sure that it's not a part of this. And I don't think that this is, the point of this is not to have just an ever-growing, like, religious list of do's and don'ts for your Sabbath. The point is to have a few helpful guardrails that protect that space. Jesus, in his time on earth, he chastised the religious leaders for their exhaustive list of things the Sabbath should and shouldn't have. So the point is not that. It's not burdens. It's boundaries. And then finally, I think to practice Sabbath delight, you have to give yourself to joy. Rabbi Reb Zellman suggests starting the Sabbath day by saying, today I will pamper my soul. For those of us who are new to Sabbath and trying to figure out what to do with a Sabbath day, maybe a great question to ask is, what could I do in this 24-hour time period that would bring me just a deep, visceral joy in God? And there are all kinds of things that you can do to bring a delight in God. And sometimes I think we draw our circle too small. Like, we have this 20th, 21st century, like, North American idea of like the quiet time. It's like 30 to 60 minutes with like your scripture and some prayer and a devotion maybe and a cup of coffee. And that's fine. Like, if that works for you and you find delight in that, do it. And if you don't find delight in that, maybe don't do that on a Sabbath. Find some way to connect with God that brings you delight. Whether that's making art or serving soup to those who are unhoused, or reading a book, or looking at the intricate design of a maple leaf, or quiet meditation on a single scripture, or giving a loved one a hug. Like, there are all kinds of ways to find delight in God. Some of the maybe more traditional Sabbath activities include things like feasting. Sabbath is not a day for fasting. Actually, Sabbath is a great day for a number of spiritual practices, but I don't think they all fit into Sabbath. If it's not a delight for you and it feels like work, something like fasting, I don't think belongs in a Sabbath day. Sabbath is a day for feasting. It's not a day for like gluttony where you're just full all day, but by all means, kids, write this down. Sabbath is a day for dessert, okay? Take that, Pastor D. There's a gift just for you. Community. Sabbath is a day for community, for relationships. God made us for relationship with Him and with others. And connecting, spending time with Christ-centered community is a great way to delight in the goodness of God. I actually encourage you to practice Sabbath with your faith community, whether that's your small group or a few close friends. Maybe be like, hey, you guys want to try this Sabbath thing together? You guys want to sync up on some of this? It's a great way to bring your faith and your friendships closer together. Gratitude. We talk about delighting in the life God has given us. Gratitude is the practice of seeing and appreciating what we have. I was introduced a couple of years ago to a prayer practice around gratitude that I love, and I'm going to offer this to you as a thought for maybe how you can practice gratitude in your Sabbath day, and it's inspired by the Hebrew word dayenu, which translates to it would have been enough. So when I pray with gratitude, I pray to God, it would have been enough. It would have been enough just to have a dry and safe place to lay my head down at night, but you've given my wife and I a wonderful home that we can welcome others into and use for hospitality and a place for connection. God, it would have been enough just to have you. Like just you would have been enough, but you've given me a wonderful family and a warm community of people around me. Your gifts are gracious. It would have been enough if you had given me rice and beans just to help me make it through the day, but God, I eat like a king with your grace. It would have been enough just to have a chance to work with my hands to provide for my family, but you've given me a job where I get to work with young people and hopefully inspire them and point them to Jesus, and a job where I can use the gifts that you've given me to help build your kingdom. God, it would have been enough if you had done just this, but look at everything you've given me. Gratitude leads us to delight in God's gifts. Continuing, you can make a strong argument that play should be a part of a Sabbath tradition, but I think this is one of the harder ones for us to figure out, because remember, we go back to our counterfeit Sabbath, and we're like, well, there's all this play in there. How do I know what should be in a real Sabbath space? And I think it requires some wisdom. It requires you to sit down with God and sort it out. But I have a few questions that could be helpful in figuring out, does my play belong in Sabbath? Number one, does this honestly draw me to delighting in God? Or is this kind of just for me? Does this bring my senses to life, or does it just distract me from reality? Does this match the pace of Sabbath, the speed of savoring? And finally, do I feel like I need to do this? Is this something where it's like, for consistency's sake, I do this every day, so I need to do it today too? Or when else would I do it if I don't do it today? If you feel like you need to do it, maybe you don't. Continuing, marital intimacy. I'll keep this brief, but in the Jewish tradition, married couples were encouraged to be intimate every Sabbath. Nature, seeing the beauty in God's creation. I really think that our appreciation of God's goodness grows when we spend time in, that thing that He spent 6 days creating. And this doesn't have to mean like a 3-hour drive to the Sawtooth. This can mean walking barefoot in the grass. It can be sitting by the Boise River and listening to it flow by. It can be watching a tree sway in the breeze, but it's seeing God in the world around you. So get outside. God made the outside. It's great. Trust me. Finally, one of the most time-honored Sabbath traditions is that of a Sabbath meal. It is this collision of feasting and community, gathering together with friends and family for a slow and unrushed and intentional meal together with no rush to get to anything after or wrap that time up. In the Jewish tradition, this would have been Friday night. So the Jewish traditional Sabbath was sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, and they would start their Sabbath with the lighting of candles and the enjoying of a meal together with family or community. In the Christian tradition, where Sunday is often a Sabbath day, it often looks like a Sunday lunch after worshiping together, gathering together with family or friends for this unrushed meal. And it can look like a lot of things, but I want to give you one example of what it looks like for somebody who is pursuing God through Sabbath. So check this out.
So my name is Jaron Oda, and my Sabbath rhythm usually looks like a Google Calendar indicator going off saying, bring the chips and guac, or bring a bottle of wine at around 5:30 p.m. on Friday. So I go ahead and I do that. I head over to this family's home who's become literally like a second Ohana to me. So I've been doing Sabbath with them for a couple years. And I'll walk in there with my goodies, and we'll welcome one another. And then the first, and I think one of the most important things we've been doing is literally taking off things like our watches or our phones, things that would remind us of stuff that we need to accomplish or produce, or remind us of even honestly the anxieties or things that are going on in our lives, and literally set it aside in this box. And we even have a chance to like write down things that our minds maybe have been ruminating on from the week, and get a chance to write our fears, write our anxieties, and write our worries, and leave them in the box for a time. And that box goes away, and then we get a chance to read a psalm together around the dinner table with some candles that are lit, and share a wonderful meal that everyone's contributed towards. And that usually leads us into just unstructured time of conversation and relationship where we get to just be with one another. And I'm just gonna be upfront, Sabbath in practice at first is difficult, but when it becomes routine, you really start to yield some of the beauty of it. So routine has helped me in the temptation to remain uncommitted to the practice. And I don't know how else to say it, but when you surrender to the fact that I need routine to position myself into something good, that's where you begin to experience the life of Sabbath in the midst of temptation to not do it.
So you might say, all right, D, what do I do with this? Maybe there's some of you here that you're like, I'm not even sure I believe in God, much less that God is something to be delighted in. And if that's you, I just want to say I'm glad you're here. I think honestly, the next step is just keep showing up and lean into those questions. And others of you might say, well, I want to obey God's command to Sabbath, and I want to receive that gift, and I want to do it right. And I know that probably means like I need to stop my productive work, my vocation, my homework, my chores, my house projects. But what do I do with this? Living it out is not always that simple. What about family life? Some of you may take care of older members of your family. Some of you may be parents taking care of little kids like Haley and I. We talk about this. Can we just like lock Slate in his room for 24 hours? Like God can do more with 6 days than I can do with 7, right? No, you can't. You can't do those things. You have to figure out, how do we live this practice? You might be like, okay, outside of work, like what are the rules? Is a hike in or is it out? What about golf? What about skiing? What about watching a movie with my family? Like, what are the rules? And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for all people. That's not what we find in Scripture. What we find instead is an invitation and a command to stop and to rest and to delight and to worship. And it's up to us to figure out how to obey those directives in the context of our own lived lives. And remember, this is a practice. It's a practice. You may one day set aside, okay, here's my Sabbath, here's my plan, and it falls apart. That's okay, that was practice. And maybe so is next week too, and maybe so is next week too, but we continue taking those steps. And this week, I want to end by going back to a question that we started with earlier, and I want to give you a minute to consider it, because I really think this question is key. I'm going to give you about a minute. I'm going to ask you, hey, consider this, and maybe even start writing those 2 lists, that I will list and I won't list. What could I do for 24 hours that would bring me deep joy in God? Delighting in the world He created, delighting in the life that He's given you, and delighting in God Himself. Take a minute, reflect on this, and then we'll continue singing together.